working together on these issues, we sort of came to a point where we need to really evaluate our transportation network with respect to, flooding impacts, like flooding that happens today. We even see what we call sunny day flooding, or high tide flooding during seasonal high tides and monthly high tides. We're seeing impacts already that impact, communities, impact, neighborhoods, specific neighborhoods, and impact infrastructure. And we decided, like, we just really need to get a handle on how the roadway network is actually responding to these types of flooding events. And if these flooding events were to get worse in the future due to sea level rise and coastal storms, like how would we deal with that? How would we react to or plan for those types of impacts? So the Rockingham Planning Commission is one of, I think it's 5 out of the 9 of the regional planning commissions in New Hampshire, which are deemed metropolitan planning organizations, MPOs. So we are in charge of transportation planning under Federal Highway Administration and our state DOT. To do transportation planning in our region. So what we decided to do was we created a proposal, and we got funding through our New Hampshire Coastal Program through a NOAA Project of Special Merit grant to do a transportation corridor analysis of our transportation network. So what we decided to do was sort of like, how do we evaluate flooding on our roadway network? And so we decided to use our transportation demand model, which is part of our MPO function, right? So a transportation demand model is basically a model that's used for a totally different purpose. It's for transportation modeling of, functional roadway classification and, safety and, traffic volumes. And we put in all these demographics of things like population density, employment centers, all kinds of different parameters that go into this model. And we thought, well, how about use this model to model what happens if we remove a bridge or we remove a segment of roadway because it's flooded? Like, where would the traffic go? Like, where, would it be rerouted to a different route, throughout the transportation network? So we tweaked our model significantly. It took us quite a few months actually to do this because it wasn't really designed, to do this kind of thing. And so we tweaked the model, and we laid on our sea level rise projections, which were 1 foot, 1.7 feet, or 2 feet, I think, 4 feet, and then 6 feet of sea level rise, and projections of flooding impact onto our roadway network, and to see like what would happen, like where would the traffic go? Are there alternative routes into the, across the network? One thing that we were limited by was that the network, our model did not include every single like local road, like little tiny subdivision roads and connector roads and stuff. We couldn't include all of those into our model. So there were a few holes actually in our modeling effort. But we were able to actually kind of do that on a more manual basis. Like once we started to look at the transportation network and where things were breaking down, to go in and look at our paper maps basically, or our web maps basically, and see where like alternative routes could actually happen on a more local road. So getting back to our transportation model, so we put in all these demographics and statistics, ran the model, and one thing we found out very quickly was that by the time we got to 6 feet of sea level rise, the model just broke down. It wouldn't work. It couldn't work anymore because it just the amount of impact in roadway incapacity basically, or non-functional capacity of the roadways was so great and so prevalent that the model couldn't move traffic around and divert it anywhere because the roadway network was so compromised. So that was an interesting, sort of aha moment, I think, in our modeling. And I guess, I'm sorry, I should have stepped back a little bit. And I don't know if, because people are coming from all around the country, I think from different parts of the state. So you probably aren't familiar with with New Hampshire specific stuff, but what we did was we looked at our coastal route, which is Route 1A in our model, which is our most coastal route. Then we step back to our next state highway, which is Route 1, like moving west away from the coast. And then our next major, avenue was Route 95, which is an interstate highway. And so we kind of defined our geography from the coast all the way out to this Route 95 west. It's probably, as the crow flies, probably about maybe 15 miles at the most, 20 maybe, at 15 probably-ish. And then we started to connect the communities that were, including in the model, the communities that were connecting to these roadway networks, especially from an east-west component of our model, because we have these, so Route 1A, Route 195, these three major corridors, all north-south, corridors in our roadway network. And that's great. And that's great for efficiency. But, what we were lacking was the detail of our east-west connections away from the coast to the interior parts of our roadway network. So we brought in quite a few communities that were peripheral to, our westernmost border of our modeling area, because those east-west, connections were so important. Some of them are local roads, some of them are state highways, it's a combination of both. So our geography of looking at our modeling was to try and incorporate all of the possible avenues for, I think, for lack of a better word, sort of like, moving people from point A to point B, like what's the most efficient route for them to get there. So we sort of took a little bit more global approach from just being on the coast to being a more, somewhat inland, to accommodate these communities where local roads may be impacted by the demand of travel if certain road segments were closed on the coast. So sort of stepping back from that, one of the aspects of our travel demand model was to, again, sort of try to move traffic away from impacted roadways. So roadways that would be flooded and impassable during certain conditions, and trying to find alternative routes for them. And so that brought on an entirely different, or a whole set of questions about roadway capacity, roadway, ability to actually transmit that kind of traffic. So if you're having large trucks coming off of a state highway or a state route onto a local road, they may not be equipped to handle the weight, handle the volume of traffic, and may not have appropriate sort of safety precautions. So a lot of them just have stop signs. There are no like traffic lights or anything like that. So trying to if you were trying to wayfind yourself around an alternative route, how would you actually do that, and how would that happen? And could it be done in a safe manner? And anyone who lives in a coastal area knows that. Well, I do. I live on the coast of near the coast of New Hampshire, and this is where I grew up actually. And everyone knows the shortcuts to get around, I-95 off of in the summertime when people are coming north on, to Maine, and on the weekend, or coming south on the other side. You totally know where the shortcuts are and what alternative routes you want to take. So they're all known, like we all know where to go. But we went into the model to do was to show us where those routes were, on a very concrete kind of basis. So just pausing for a moment to recollect my thoughts here. So the travel demand model was sort of our vehicle to kind of get to where we wanted to go as far as modeling our flood impacts. And I think that, our model is transferable to other communities, not just coastal flooding. but it's actually was used by the National Regional Planning Commission, who our current director at Rockingham was a former director of, and he used it in this way and said, what would happen if this bridge went out in our community, or this road was like gone? Like how would traffic, flow in our community? So it's, I think our methodology is definitely transferable to an inland community, a riverine community, any place where there are impacts to roads, where your roadway network fails for whatever reason, floods, earthquakes, whatever. I mean, so many, let's choose our natural disaster, right? Scenario. There's so many of them. And so, what we wanted to do is like build sort of a, our methodology was about coastal flooding, but I think the methodology and the strategy behind the model was to try and create something that could be transferable to other communities that were struggling with and dealing with, road closure and transportation network failure, basically. And so I think that our model does that in a very sort of a, I guess, sort of in a somewhat of a general way right now, but I think it could be tweaked and certainly used by others. And it is definitely going to be a public resource, a public access resource for other people to use. And we certainly would share the technology that we've developed with others through this project. So that's kind of a little bit of an overview of our project. I think what where we're kind of landing as a group, we're sort of still in the assessment phases of looking at the model results and looking at sort of prioritizing certain sites within the network that are super important. And what we actually found as part of this sort of fact-finding part of our project was that that certain individual road segments don't operate independent of each other. Anyone who works in transportation knows that. So we started to group the road segments that were impacted together as groups, as sort of a an area or a group of impacted roads, because when we look at impacts to a transportation network from a, let's say, just start from the high level, from a state highway perspective, we see areas of roadways are impacted, but they also are connected to local roads and like every single access point, driveway, everywhere on the roadway network. And so anything that the state highway department decides to do, or the New Hampshire Department of Transportation decides to do on the network, is going to affect every single access point or connection to that roadway. So we're starting to kind of look at how those things dovetail. So we started to group things together, because like this local roadway network would not work efficiently or be able to get from point A to point B if it can't get to the state highway, and vice versa. And so we started to, like I said, group those things together into a sort of a functional sort of area, that if anything in this network fails, any of these critical connections in this network fail, then the whole network fails, right? Because you're at some point going to get to a point where you're going to come to a road where you just can't go any further. You have to like drive, turn around and go back. So these groupings were super important to our modeling methodology from a functional standpoint, and especially when we get down into our coastal area. So from like Hampton Beach, parts of Rye, which is in the north section of our geography of our model, where there are one-way roads. Like, so if you have a one-way road that you can't get through, you really can't get anywhere from point, like I said, from point A to point B, if you have a one-way road that's blocked or impassable. So we started looking at diving into the details of how does that road structure function during a flood impact event, whether it's a seasonal high tide or if it's a coastal storm. We get nor'easters up here in New England all the time, in the winter, in the spring, and even sometimes in the fall. And so if the roadway is impassable, like what sort of contingency plans have to be in place to say, well, let's open the road up to two-way traffic during these events, because you've got to get people from, you got to get people through, and we have to get, we have to have transportation happen and get the roadway functioning again. So that was another thing, is when we started to group things together. So that was like, one group was the whole idea of a one-way road, situation where it just didn't work under a flood scenario. And then we had other groups that were slightly different in characteristics, in that they were servicing small segments of the population in a town, like in the town of Rye, where there was like a peninsula on the east side of the coastal highway, Route 1A, and they were cut off because the segment of road was flooded. So how do these people evacuate? How are they managed? How are they notified? Like when and under what conditions would their roadway be cut off? And they would be cut off from emergency services and from any kind of access whatsoever, whether it was work or going to the grocery store or whatever. So we started to like group things together a little bit and start to think about the different scenarios. And what we tried to do in our model, and we developed sort of a list of high priority sites that we hope would be what we call, and I'm doing this in air quotes, candidate sites, that would capture all of these different components of, malfunction of the transportation network, whether it was an isolated population, or if it was like roadway, just like management, like one-way streets. And then we also started to add into the mix environmental considerations. So if we were going to adapt or be resilient to a certain area of roadway, what would be the environmental considerations for that? Things like salt marsh impacts, wildlife habitat areas, which we have a lot in the seacoast, of course, being on the coast. And then things like groundwater rise, like how would that influence our pavement, conditions over time? If they were being, inundated all the time, would that, like really modify or, put into jeopardy or compromise the pavement condition? So we started to bring in all these environmental, constraints as well into our sort of, we call it our candidate sites, or our top priority sites in the model. So that's sort of an overview of what our project is all about. And we're sort of still in the assessment phase of assessing what our vulnerabilities are. We're working with researchers from the University of New Hampshire and from our New Hampshire Coastal Program, and also our staff at the Regional Planning Commission, to evaluate and sort of come out with some adaptation and resilience strategies for how to manage the transportation network. I guess one last thing I'd like to close on is sort of, I think I mentioned this before, is that our transportation model doesn't include all of the local roads in our model. We just can't functionally do that. It's just like too much detail. We don't have that amount of detail, but it's super important to know where the shortcuts are, right? In the transportation network. If a road's flooded, local people are going to know where to go. And they're going to start going through like, small subdivision roads and small like interior local roads that maybe have a stop sign or don't have a stop sign. They don't have any controlled intersections with lights or anything like that. And like having large amounts of traffic rerouting through these small neighborhoods could be super detrimental to them for all the obvious reasons, safety, but also the condition of the pavement is not often, in many cases, designed to handle that kind of traffic volume. They were built a long time ago. Often they have been, built 30, 40, 50 years ago, even longer than that in some cases. And they just can't handle the kind of traffic volume that would potentially be rerouted through these local tiny roads. And, who wants to see like a huge, tractor trailer, driving through their neighborhood when that never happened before, right? Under certain conditions. And, these conditions that we project from sea level rise, span out to 2050, 2100. We're looking at sea level scenarios that are, kind of forward thinking. And what would happen if that kind of scenario happened twice a day, every day in your life? And what would that do to the local roads if it happened twice a day, every day during, high tide flooding? And, there's anecdotal evidence, and actually not even anecdotal, I guess, from places like, I used to work in Maryland, and on the eastern shore of Maryland, there are places in like Dorchester County, a very low-lying, tiny little, rural county in Maryland, where they have to adjust the school bus schedules, going through the town because the roads are flooded twice a day. So they have to find ways to get around like the flooding so they can get these kids back to, back to their homes or to school, for example. And so the flooding issues are real, and they're happening now. And it's happening now in New Hampshire. I would say, I think the estimate for this year, for 2021, was that there would be 52 instances in the year of 2021 where tide would exceed 11 feet, which means tide will overtop roads and flood neighborhoods. And that's significant. That's like a significant statistic for communities to deal with. And, they are trying to deal with it with things like giving special permits for residents who live in these high risk flood areas to be able to park in a municipal parking lot overnight so that their car doesn't get flooded during high tide. But also just raising awareness in the community of when these events will happen and how often they happen, and that these are the kind of precautions you need to take to make sure that you're safe and secure, that you can get to your home, you can travel about safely. And so we're hoping that this model will really kind of shine a light on some of these transportation challenges moving forward in our region, because like I said, they're certainly real today, and they'll only get worse in the future. And just to close, I think one of the things out of the model that was really interesting, so when we started to develop our list of priority sites that we wanted to look at as part of our priority sites in our model, was like, what sites were impacted at 1 feet and 1.7 feet? Because that's today, and that's here and now, and that's what happens today. And so we wanted to make sure that those sites got elevated to the top of the priority list, because as we move forward into the future, like we look at 2050 with 4 feet of sea level rise, those sites are only going to get worse, and they're, the impacts are only going to get greater and more widespread. So, sort of our first cut at looking at sites was to look at those ones that are now impacted or will be impacted in the very near future, and looking at the options, adaptation and resilience options for improving those sites. So if the state DOT or the town is going to put money into improving a roadway, and one of these sites is on their radar, like, why would you not improve it to at least 4 feet to build it out to a sort of a time frame of 2050? Why would you put money into just doing a patch, sort of putting a band-aid on the practice, and not just improve it to the standards of 2050? So that's one of the other questions, and that we're talking with our state DOT about, and trying to put into our implementation plans and our improvement plans. We have to start looking a little bit further forward, and not just putting a band-aid on things, and really trying to try and improve the roadway network to a degree that where it's functional across, I was going to say its lifespan, but a lot of these roadway networks have been around for 100 years. So it's not like the lifespan is going to stop at 2050. It's going to, extend way beyond that, probably, right? So starting to put into place policies, investments, and plans that plan for a future scenario of flood impact. So I think I'm going to close with that. That's a lot to take in. And like I said at the very beginning, I have a PowerPoint presentation that I'm happy to share. We'll have some of these details in it. But I just really wanted to tell the story today and not be a PowerPoint person. So.
Thank you so much, Julie, for information. Oops. Some noise from my end. 1 second.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the chat now. I'm looking at the chat questions. I didn't have a chance
to. One really good information. I had a few questions, and one of them was how far in the project are you, and are there any preliminary results that are available for public access right now?
Yes, actually there are. Thank you for the question. We have a project website, which I will provide to everyone on this group. We have basically our web-based maps, which is sort of an interactive GIS platform on the web, where you can access the results of our modeling results. And you can go on and look at the maps. You can zoom, our geography is pretty big. So when you come into the first, frame of the maps, it's super small, but you can zoom into any single area of the maps, and you can click on and off all the different GIS layers, and zoom in, and it's very functional. And we're actually I think probably tomorrow, we're going to add sort of a tutorial document to that website that just kind of tells you basically how to navigate and how to move around the site and how to look at different aspects of the modeling results. So hopefully that'll be up in a couple of days. I'd be happy to share that with you. We also have again, PowerPoint presentations, and we have notes from the different meetings that we've had with our New Hampshire Department of Transportation folks, and also some of our project partners.
Excellent.
There's lots of resources available for people to do a little bit of a deeper dive into the project.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I think that would be great if we could share some information with the group. Maybe I should let some other people ask questions. I had a couple of other questions, but maybe I will ask later. Anybody in the group has a question or some thought, comments? Yes, Karin.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Julie, for the great presentation. I work with Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission, so your neighbor just to the north, and we are definitely dealing with a lot of the same issues in our coastal communities with high tide flooding, sunny day flooding, and storm surge impacts on a lot of our important roads. And I'm just realizing that this could be a really great study for us to do in our region as well. And our MPO, we don't have access to a local transportation demand model. The state has a model, but we don't have one for our region. However, we do have access to a platform called Streetlight Data, which is a big data analytics online cloud platform. It uses cell phone GPS data and some machine learning algorithms to track transportation movements. And I'm just thinking, I'm wondering if anyone else has experience using Streetlight Data for this sort of detour planning type study, because it could be really useful looking. You can narrow down to periods of time where, say on March 18th last year, one road was closed. You can actually go back and look at the data from that day and see how transportation patterns were different on that day versus, the average of previous days. and use that to make some assumptions about future travel patterns due to sea level rise. So Julie, do you have experience with that? Is that something you're incorporating into your project? And or has anyone else looked at streetlight data for that sort of use?
I guess getting back to your first question, Karina, it's nice to meet you finally in person, like on Zoom. We're like a huge fan of your coastal adaptation and your sustainability program you have in Southern Maine. You and it's awesome. So I will have to go back and check with our director and our directors of the Stratford Regional Planning Commission and Rockingham Planning Commission, but I don't think, I would think that our travel on demand model would be a public open source sort of product, although we have paid for, private consultants